X-Talks connects professionals in the life science, medical device, and food industries with useful content like webinars, job openings, articles, and virtual meetings to help you succeed in your career. This life science-focused podcast brings together some of our editorial staff to share insights into the latest B2B industry news to keep you up to date. X-Talks is excited to introduce the inaugural issue of X-Talks Clinical Edge, where innovation meets expertise. This digital magazine offers you exclusive conversations with some of the brightest minds and trendsetters of the clinical trials community, offering you a front row seat to the evolving landscape of clinical research. As you dive into the rich content of X-Talks Clinical Edge magazine's first issue, you'll discover insights from pharmaceutical companies, patient advocacy groups, leading clinical research organizations, and an ensemble of key opinion leaders from organizations like the Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative and the Mayo Clinic. Follow the link in the show notes or visit clinicaledge.xtalks.com/issue 1 to dive into the first issue of X-Talks Clinical Edge magazine and be a part of the conversation shaping the next era of clinical trials. That's clinicaledge.xtalks.com/issue 1.
Hello and welcome to the X-Talks Life Science Podcast. I'm Aisha Rashid, Senior Life Science Journalist at xtalks.com, and this week I'm delighted to introduce a very special guest on the show today. We have with us Tope Leyimu, who is a toxic exposure attorney at Motley Rice. Tope will speak to us about a litigation she is leading over hair straightening products containing harmful chemicals. The FDA recently issued a recommendation for the recall of chemical hair relaxers containing harmful chemicals. While the FDA has initiated its rulemaking process, a ban hasn't been implemented yet. The products, which have historically been targeted primarily at Black and Brown women of African descent, have drawn major concern due to their links with reproductive-related cancers such as ovarian, cervical, and uterine cancer. An October 2022 study by the National Institutes of Health revealed that women using chemical straighteners face a 150% increased risk of uterine cancer. Attorneys leading the case, including Tope, say that the FDA proposal is a significant step in advancing public health for women, particularly Black and Brown women, who are disproportionately impacted by many of these products that are alleged to be harmful. To learn more about the products and this litigation, let's turn to Tope. Tope, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you. I'd like to start off by asking you about some of the adverse health effects linked to the use of hair smoothing products that could contain harmful chemicals like formaldehyde and formaldehyde-releasing chemicals.
Sure. Well, formaldehyde is most commonly used as an ingredient in embalming fluid and in the industrial context as well. It's colorless, it's highly toxic chemical, but it's also added to cosmetics, and personal care products as a sort of preservative. So among other health issues like respiratory disease and related exposure to irritants of body parts like the eyes, the lungs, the skin, the throat, it's also linked to an increase of several cancers. But when we're talking about hair relaxers, that's sort of a toxic soup, if you will, of chemicals that can also include phthalates and parabens and other sort of dangerous compounds. And so what's at issue in our litigation is not just one chemical per se in one product. It's these chemicals as a whole and the synergistic effect of the chemicals contained therein interacting with each other. So separate from just the issue of formaldehyde releasing chemicals, there have been studies on the health impacts of relaxers on Black and Brown women of African descent. One of those studies is a sister study. It speaks to the use of straighteners and other hair products and the incidence of uterine cancer, as you had just alluded to. I believe that study came out in 2022. It's a United States-based study, and it included approximately 34,000 women, ranging from the ages of about 35 to 74. Large, racially and ethnically diverse prospective cohort, and they reported their use of hair products. And so a lot of findings came from that studies, which were interesting to us, and the crux of this litigation as well.
And before we get into some of the other questions that I have here, really being such an important issue, I think I want to ask how listeners can get in touch with you if they believe they've been affected by products that contain some of these harmful chemicals.
Sure, you can reach out to my law firm, Motley Rice, directly. And Aisha, I will give you email address, phone number, and a web link that you could share with your listeners in the description of the podcast, so that people can directly connect with us.
Perfect. Thank you so much for that. And really, this relates to the idea about getting the word out to such a large population. And as you mentioned, that study by the NIH, where the age range so vast, and it's very critical in terms of really reaching the consumers, which are so diverse in terms of demographics and in terms of age alone. So this is very, very important.
Absolutely.
What are some strategies in terms of like really increasing awareness around this issue?
I think scientific studies and epidemiological studies are one way to raise awareness. Going back to the sister study that I was just talking about, the general takeaway was that after an average of nearly 11 years of follow-up, that women who had reported the use of these hair straightening products were almost twice as likely to have developed uterine cancer than those who did not, after adjusting for other factors that might affect risk. And so women who had reported frequent use of straighteners, and we say frequent use more than 4 times in a previous year, were about 2.5 times more likely to develop uterine cancer. Wow. So studies like that certainly shine a light in terms of awareness, raising awareness in conversations in these communities that has been happening, is becoming more amplified now. And it's important because not everyone is aware. It's important to understand that for many people, it was almost a rite of passage to have their hair relaxed. Mm-hmm. Many of these hair relaxers were targeted specifically to young people. And when I say young people, I mean children. Many of our clients have been using hair relaxers since they were very, very young, before even teen years. Wow. So when you just think about that for a minute, childhood, puberty, these are particularly sensitive times when the body is undergoing crucial cellular and hormonal changes. So only more recently has this awareness really started spreading. This lawsuit in and of itself, it's my belief, is a measure of raising awareness. And certainly the FDA proposed ban is also a way to heighten awareness as well.
Indeed. And so what are the case criteria? And can you explain a little bit more about that, provide details on that?
Sure. So the case criteria, ovarian cancer, uterine cancer, endometrial cancer, those are the cancers we are laser focused on based on the science and the epidemiological studies out there right now. As we know, science is developing. In terms of usage, it's women who have used hair relaxers for at least 5 years of continuous usage and have used hair relaxers at least 4 times a year. And if you know anything about hair relaxer and the hair relaxer process, many women very much exceed that in maintaining their straight hair over time. So 4 times a year and at least 5 years of continuous usage. In terms of the diagnosis timing, the diagnosis must have happened within 10 years of the last use. And we are also taking cases and representing the estates of women who have died after developing uterine, ovarian, and endometrial cancer, and representing their loved ones. And for those cases, the death must have been within the last 10 years.
And what are the challenges with respect to regulation? So what are the challenges that the FDA faces in enforcing such a ban on these kinds of chemicals in hair products, given their widespread use?
I suspect one might say scale, based on just the sheer amount and volume of the types of these products that contain such chemicals. I would submit, Aisha, that there's a challenge to any ban enforcement, right? So that's certainly not a novel element of these particular products. People become almost dependent on the use of certain products, whether it's just the habitual, almost routine frequency of use or how it makes them feel. But in my mind's eye, the emphasis or concern on the challenge of a ban enforcement has to be looked at in the context and understanding that what we're talking about is products that are hurting and killing women. And at the crux of all of this is just knowledge and education. If people have the requisite knowledge and information about the true potential ramifications of using these products, then and only then can they make informed choices on whether or not to use them. So it's about the lack of accurate and complete information, which strips women, especially in these instances, from the ability to fully make that choice.
And how do you foresee the beauty industry responding to the proposed ban, given that how you mentioned that, these products are so widely used?
I can't foresee how they'll respond. What I hope they'll do is take stock of how harmful these chemicals are, especially now that it's really more front and center of our collective consciousness, and take steps to discontinue products that have these harmful chemicals. The gravity of what we're talking about is so great.
Yeah.
The beauty industry exists because, in essence, women in particular are told, we're not quite good enough as is, right? An XYZ product will make us look better, feel better, be better, perform better professionally. The trajectory of our career will be positively impacted, will be more accepted in society, more desirable, whatever the case may be. But it's not really beauty if it's harming you. And so I will say there are some other countries who are more on the ball than ours, and in the United States, and still have robust beauty industries. It's not just doable, but it's necessary and it's urgent. And I hope companies rise to the occasion because lives literally depend on it.
And you did touch upon this, and we did, speak a bit about this, but can you discuss further the disproportionate impact these harmful beauty products have had on women, particularly of African descent, since they have been historically targeted towards this demographic?
Sure. And the best way to do that is a bit of a history lesson because as a Black woman, I know this very intimately, that the topic of Black hair, especially for Black and brown women of African descent, carries with it significant historical weight. It's very loaded. And historically, Black women have dealt with and deal with trauma and contempt, really, surrounding the texture of our hair, and have been made to feel compelled to conform to Eurocentric beauty standards, right? And these are often biologically unrealistic standards, and they underscore the notion that straight hair is an indicator of moral aptitude, of social status or social standing and professional ability. And that hair that is textured, so my hair literally as it grows from my head, Afro textured hair, if you will, that's been branded as less than, unattractive, unprofessional, unappealing. And so that sort of scrutiny and degradation over the grade and texture of hair goes back to slavery times, where slaves with a lighter complexion and less coily hair were favored to work in the home in less strenuous positions than ones in the plantation fields with coarser hair. And because Afro-textured hair reflects African heritage rather than European ancestry, Afro-textured hair was a symbol of low social status. So in addition to aesthetics and beauty preferences, based on the historical context that we've just sort of discussed, straight hair and the maintenance of it has always been a way to assimilate and integrate for Black women into education and professional and social spaces. And so hair discrimination is real. There have been studies looking into, Black and brown girls who have experienced hair discrimination amongst their peers in spaces where they are the minority. This is this sort of social and cultural pressure for many Black and brown women of cultural of African descent, precipitated this concept of straightening hair in the first place. And so these products are proportionately affecting these Black and brown women because their hair is more coarse and coily and Afro textured in its natural state. And I will say, we've very recently seen the Crown Act that was introduced in 2021. And it stands for Creating a Respectful and Open World for Natural Hair. It's a legislative bill introduced in both houses of Congress to address discrimination against protective hairstyles worn
Mhm.
predominantly by women of color, like locks, like braids,
Right.
twists, So when you consider the historical context and the implications of classism and social
Yeah.
fitness and just notions of professionalism and that Eurocentric concept of beauty, it is no surprise that it is Black and brown women
Mhm.
of African descent who are disproportionately prone to use and thus impacted most by these products and their harmful effects.
Yeah, indeed, that's very heavy and loaded topic. And thank you so much for providing the very important historical context. And so, you did mention the crown and how that was brought up in Congress, which is wonderful. And so, how do we overcome these kinds of historical biases and standards that have been so entrenched in certain communities? Obviously, we're talking about Black and brown communities. And what measures, I think this relates to a question I did ask earlier, but are there any specific measures being implemented to raise awareness among particularly the Black community about the risks associated with hair relaxers? And is there a shift in sort of beauty standards and how women are looking at their hair and at their beauty now, and how can we facilitate that as a society further?
Sure. I mean, I think you can never underestimate the importance of information and education. Education, education, education
Yeah.
to our own communities and to other communities, and empathy, right? Understanding historical frameworks with which we decide what biases that we have against each other and how we discriminate, even if not intentionally. So that's important in raising awareness and also just overcoming this gargantuan issue. And as you can see through the Crown Act, sometimes things don't change unless they are pushed to change through legislation. In my experience and what I do and what I feel so passionate about, sometimes things don't change unless pushed in the arm of litigation.
Right.
And so those things are happening not just to create awareness, but to literally strong arm and push things in the direction and trajectory that they should be. And I think Representative Ayanna Pressley said it best when she said, regardless of how we wear our hair, we should be allowed to show up in the world without putting our health at risk. And that's really the crux of all of this.
Indeed, very profound and very, very simplistic, you would think, but just overcoming so many shackles and, so many entrenched ideas. And so, Tope, where are things at the moment with the litigation, and what are some of the steps moving forward, and any timelines for things, and what can we expect to hear?
Oh, sure. I would be a fool if I were to guesstimate timeline of litigation.
With
So
litigation, yeah, I shouldn't be asking
I
you
won't
that.
venture to do that, but we're certainly out the gate. I can tell you that much. And just for your edification and the listeners, this is a multi-district litigation. And so what that means is there are cases filed all over the country, but they have been consolidated in front of the Northern District of Illinois in that court. For efficiency of discovery purposes, for the discovery portion of the cases. And that's a lot of information exchange through documents and testimony between parties. So that's the phase that the litigation is in right now, and is ongoing. There's cases being filed every day. And that's where we sit right now. Excited to pursue this more and see where we end.
Right. And we wish you all the best in your work. Very important work that you're leading here. And, thank you so much for being on the show and providing your insights and the details on the case, and providing so much context and about this whole issue. And we really, really appreciate your time.
Well, thank you so much. I appreciate the platform to speak on this important topic.
Thank you. That's the end of this episode of the X Talks Life Science podcast. If you liked today's show, don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe. Thank you, everyone, and see you all next week. Bye for now.
Thanks for listening to the X Talks Life Science Podcast. If you enjoyed our discussions today, please share the episode with your friends and colleagues, and be sure to subscribe in order to be notified when a new episode is released. To join in on the discussion, you can find X Talks on social media. Email podcast@xtalks.com or comment on the articles directly. Links are in the show description. Take a moment to join our community at xtalks.com to get access to everything we have to offer, including webinars, job listings, virtual meetings, articles, and more. The views and opinions expressed in the podcast are those of the speakers sharing them. They should not be taken as professional advice and do not necessarily reflect the policy or position Honeycomb Worldwide. For further information, email us at podcast@xtalks.com. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next week.